The first thing you notice is the cold. It's the kind of January morning where the air itself feels sharp enough to cut skin. Snowflakes drift lazily under a dull gray sky, but the ground is packed hard. Weeks of storms compress into a slick, treacherous sheet of ice. And then there's the tape, that bright yellow strip stretched between mailbox posts, shivering in the wind like a warning to stay away from whatever's inside. Behind it, blue lights pulse against the white landscape, turning the snow into a sickly strobe of red and blue. Reporters crowd the sidewalk, breath turning to steam, lenses fogging in the cold. They're jostling for position, calling out over the hiss of their own cameras. "Karen, did you kill him? Karen, what happened that night?" She doesn't answer. A woman in a black winter coat, hair pulled back head low, is ushered past them by two uniformed officers. Her boots crunch on the ice, every step deliberate. She keeps her eyes forward, as if she's not walking through a crowd at all. As if this is some other place, some other morning. Somewhere far away, a siren wails. Canton, Massachusetts. A town that wears its New England charm like a well-worn sweater. Colonial houses, coffee shops with handwritten signs. A place where everybody knows your name. And yet this morning, the streets hum with something else. Something sharper. The murder of a Boston police officer here isn't just a tragedy. It's a political earthquake. The victim, John O'Keefe, a veteran officer with 16 years on the force. Respected, beloved, if you believe the statements from his colleagues. The accused, his girlfriend Karen Red, 41 years old, financial analyst, smart, self-assured, and now, the face on every evening news broadcast. But this didn't start here in the cold. To understand why the nation is about to split in two over this case, you have to go back to the kind of relationship people thought they understood from the outside. John and Karen were, by most accounts, an enviable couple. Successful careers, matching smiles and social photos, a shared orbit of friends who were also police officers, firefighters, and community figures. But as with most things, the closer you look, the more cracks you see. There were whispers, not loud enough to be front-page gossip, but enough to seep through social circles. Arguments after nights out, tension about loyalty, about trust. Still, nobody expected their story to end in a snow-covered driveway. That night, January 28, 2022, the snow was already falling. Friends say Karen and John had been drinking at a few local spots before ending up at a party hosted by one of John's colleagues. Somewhere in a retelling, the details start to shift depending on who's speaking. Karen says she dropped him off there, that he went inside, that she drove away, her red taillights swallowed by the snowstorm. Hours later, just after dawn, John is found lying in the front yard, face down, his body dusted with snow, skin pale, bruising already visible, hypothermia, blunt force trauma to the head. Inside the crime scene tape, investigators pick their way across the yard. One stoops down beside the body. Another glance toward the street, where Karen's SUV, or at least the idea of it, is already become the center of every whispered theory. They're speaking in low tones, but one phrase drifts above the crunch of boots on snow. "We got our suspect already." The camera in your mind's eye pulls back, over the yard, over the police tape, over the watching crowd. Somewhere behind one of those drawn curtains, a neighbor watches, and later, when the news crew comes knocking, they'll say one thing that sticks. If she didn't do it, then someone else here did, and they're still walking free. That's the problem with small towns and murder trials. Once people take sides, there's no middle ground. And in Canton, those lines were drawn quickly. It didn't matter if you were a neighbor, a friend, or a stranger watching from hundreds of miles away. Within days, you were either for Karen or against her. In the days after John O'Keefe's death, the cold still clung to everything. Snowbanks were pushed high against curbs, sidewalks glazed over with ice. The whole town moved slower, except for the gossip. That traveled fast. Karen stayed mostly indoors. Friends describe her as shell-shocked, eyes dark-ringed, voice flat. But behind closed doors, she was already telling her version of events. She hadn't run John over. She said she dropped him at that house, his colleague's house, and driven away. It was a simple claim. But simple claims don't survive long in the kind of storm that was brewing. The relationship had been complicated. They'd met in a way that made sense. Same circles, same humor, that mutual understanding of what it meant to carry yourself in public. For a while it worked, but as weeks turned into years, the edges started to fray. Friends noticed the tension. The way Karen would go quiet parties when John moved across the room. The late-night phone calls that ended in slammed doors. The night of January 28th was supposed to be routine. Dinner, drinks, a gathering at a fellow officer's home. But something shifted somewhere between the bar and that driveway. Karen told investigators she'd been drinking too. Enough to know she shouldn't stay at the party. Enough to turn the car around after dropping him off. To make her way home through the snow. And then, in the morning, the discovery. Police statements described John's body as partially covered in snow, wearing no gloves, one shoe missing. His injuries were strange, consistent. Prosecutors argued with being struck by a vehicle, but the defense would later highlight what wasn't consistent: the lack of certain debris. The questions about how his injuries matched the fall of snow that night. Already, suspicion was coiling itself around Karen's name. What made it worse or better, depending on which side you were on, was the speed. Less than 48 hours after the body was found, whispers began turning into something sharper. One neighbor claimed they'd heard an engine rev in the early hours. A friend recalled Karen saying something at a bar about hitting John's truck. The police didn't confirm much in those first days, but their body language told its own story. This was a suspect they believed in. And then came the knock on Karen's door. The arrest. The charges. Second-degree murder, manslaughter while under the influence, leaving the scene. Her mugshot hit the news within hours. The headline above it read, "Killer Girlfriend." But in living rooms and kitchen tables across Massachusetts, another conversation was taking shape. If Karen wasn't guilty, if she didn't hit him with her SUV, then what really happened in that house? It's a question that would shadow every move the prosecution made. Because for every person convinced Karen Red was a violent, drunken killer, there was someone else who believed she was a convenient scapegoat, and that the real story had never left that front yard. And soon, the first cracks in the official version of events will begin to show. It started with the charge sheet: second-degree murder, manslaughter while operating under the influence, leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. It was a devastating list, not just for what it accused Karen of, but for how neatly it fit the narrative the Boston police seemed eager to present. A drunk, jealous girlfriend, an argument turned deadly, a man left to freeze in the snow. But the problem with neat narratives is that they fall apart under too much light. And once the trial process began, light was exactly what this case would be flooded with. In the courtroom, the prosecution wasted no time framing Karen as a woman spiraling out of control. They called witnesses who described her drinking that night, her erratic behavior, and statements they claimed she made about hitting John's car. They showed the jury a picture of her black SUV, the paint, the bumper, the potential damage points. On paper, it was convincing. In the minds of many watching from home, it was already over. But Karen's defense team came armed with something the prosecution wasn't prepared for: a story of their own. They didn't just challenge the state's theory. They dismantled it piece by piece. They argued that John's injuries were inconsistent with being struck by Karen's SUV, pointing to the absence of certain debris, the positioning of his body, and the lack of tire marks that should have been visible in the snow. More than that, they took aim at the investigation itself. They accused the police of tunnel vision, of locking onto Karen from the start and ignoring every other possible explanation. The name at the center of their counterattack was Michael Proctor, the lead investigator, the man responsible for gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and holding the threads of this case together. The defense painted Proctor as biased from the beginning. They brought forward text messages in which he allegedly mocked Karen's family and made crude remarks about the case. They suggested he had personal ties to people inside the house where John was found, ties that could explain why no one inside that party seemed to face the same level of scrutiny as Karen. And then came the whispers of something darker, a cover-up, In the defense's telling, John had been assaulted inside the house during or after party. He was then dragged outside, left to die in the snow, his body becoming the first thing Karen would see the next morning. It was a story designed to plant a seed in the jury's mind. If Karen didn't kill John, then who did? The prosecution scoffed at the idea. They called it a conspiracy theory, a desperate attempt to deflect blame. But the more the defense leaned into it, the more the case became something bigger than a murder trial. It became a public referendum on trust. Trust in police, trust in the system, and trust in the stories we're told. The first trial in 2024 ended with no verdict. A hung jury. To some, that was proof the defense had done its job. They'd created enough doubt to keep Karen out of prison. To others, it was a travesty, a delay of justice for a fallen officer. In the streets outside the courthouse, the divide was visible. On one side, supporters wearing Free Karen shirts and holding signs accusing the police of corruption. On the other, John's colleagues and friends, holding photos of him in uniform, chanting for her conviction. By the time the second trial rolled around in the spring of 2025, the case had become a national spectacle. True crime podcasts dissected every piece of testimony. Cable news ran split-screen coverage of the courtroom and the protest lines outside. Social media became a battlefield, with hashtags like #JusticeForJohn and #FreeKaren trending on the same days. Inside the courthouse, the air was different now. Tighter, more electric. The defense knew what worked in the first trial, and they doubled down. The prosecution knew they couldn't afford another mistrial, and they sharpened their focus. Witnesses were cross-examined with surgical precision. Expert testimony clashed in the blur of diagrams, measurements, and forensic jargon. And all the while, the jurors sat in silence, faces unreadable. But as the trial pushed towards conclusion, there was one question that remained unanswered. One the prosecution seemed increasingly uncomfortable addressing. What exactly happened inside that house before John's body ended up in the snow? That question hung over the second trial like an unspoken threat, twisting the air inside the Norfolk Superior Court into something dense and unbreathable. By late May 2025, the courtroom had become a theater, and every seat, every camera, every whisper in the gallery was part of performance. The prosecution, dressed in dark suits and clipped tones, replayed their original theory with renewed vigor. Karen, drunk and angry, struck John with her SUV, fled, and left him to die. This time, they'd sanded off the rough edges of their case, smoothing the inconsistencies into something they hoped the jury could swallow whole. They put experts back on the stand, accident reconstructionists, medical examiners, forensic analysts, walking the jurors step by step through their version of that cold January morning. Diagrams of John's injuries glowed on projector screens, while photographs of Karen's black Lexus loomed above the jury box. And yet, even in their most confident moments, there was a tension beneath their words, a shadow that belonged not to Karen, but to the questions they never truly addressed. The defense knew it. They'd been waiting for it. When their turn came, they didn't just counter the state's evidence. They unraveled it. They hammered the timeline, pointing to inconsistencies in witness statements, contradictions about who saw what and when. They revisited Michael Proctor's misconduct, this time with sharper teeth. His text messages, his personal connections to people inside that house, the investigation shortcuts. It was all laid bare again, but now in the charged atmosphere of a nation already watching. One defense witness, a forensic pathologist, leaned over a blown-up photo of John's wounds and said plainly, "These are not classic car strike injuries. Not in these conditions. Not in this setting." The jury scribbled notes. Outside, the protest grew louder with each passing day. On the courthouse steps, two opposing camps formed their own daily ritual. Free Karen supporters waved signs accusing the police of corruption, their chants bleeding into the rhythmic calls of the Justice for John crowd on the other side. Sometimes, the lines blurred, strangers screaming inches from each other's faces, police officers stepping in to break them apart. TV trucks lined the street, anchors broadcasting live hits in front of the granite courthouse doors. On TikTok and Twitter, clips of testimony were dissected within hours, hashtags flaring up like brush fires. By the trial's final week, Both sides were running on adrenaline and spite. The prosecution's closing argument was methodical, their voice rising only at the end. You cannot let the defendant walk away from this. The evidence demands a verdict of guilty. The defense's closing was different. Softer at first, building to a point that cracked the silence. If Karen Reed is guilty, then this is over. But if she's not, if even one part of the state's case makes you pause, then you must ask yourself why. Why did they never look inside that house? Why did they never question anyone who could implicate one of their own? The jury retired. Hours turned to days. The courthouse steps filled with cameras every morning, only to empty by nightfall when no verdict came. Inside, Karen sat at a defense table, her eyes fixed forward, her hands folded so tightly they'd gone pale. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was standing room only. John's family sat in the front row, their expressions hard as marble. Karen's parents clutched each other's hands so tightly it looked painful. The clerk read the verdicts aloud. Not guilty on second-degree murder. Not guilty on manslaughter while operating under the influence. Not guilty on leaving the scene. Guilty only of operating under the influence. The sound in the room fractured. Gasps. Shouts. One side of the gallery erupted in relief, the other in outrage. Outside, the protests surged into chaos. Cheers clashing against cries of shame as news crews scrambled to capture the moment. Karen hugged her attorney, tears in her eyes. Across the aisle, John's family didn't move. It should have been the end. But it wasn't, because while Karen walked out of court with no prison sentence, the war over her guilt or innocence had only just begun. The courthouse doors closed behind her, but the noise outside followed. Protesters still pressed against the barricades, shouting at each other across a police line. Reporters jogged backwards in front of Karen. Microphones outstretched, voices overlapping. Karen, do you feel vindicated? What do you say to John's family? Are you going to sue the police? Her attorney answered most questions with the same phrase. No comment at this time. But every so often, Karen would look directly into a camera, her jaw set, her eyes unblinking, the kind of stare that made people wonder if she was trying to send a message. That night, the coverage was relentless. Cable news ran side-by-side panels. On one screen, Karen leaving court. On the other, John's family issuing a statement that they respectfully but strongly disagree with the verdict. On social media, the divide sharpened. Supporters called it a victory for the wrongfully accused. Critics called it a stain on the badge and a mockery of justice. By the next morning, the case had shifted into a new battlefield, the civil courts. John's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Karen, and her legal team confirmed they were preparing to fight it just as aggressively as they had the criminal charges. It was no longer about avoiding prison. It was about legacy, reputation, and financial ruin. Karen moved carefully in public now. When she did appear, it was calculated. A sit-down interview with a sympathetic podcast host here, a filmed walk into a lawyer's office there. She repeated the same points. She loved John, she didn't kill him, and the real story had been buried under lies and institutional protection. But the house where John died still stood, quiet and closed off, like a wound the town refused to clean. No one inside that night had ever been charged. The police never publicly named another suspect. Theories, wild, detailed, impossible to prove, continued to pour through message boards and late-night YouTube live streams. In quieter moments, when the cameras were gone, Karen's life was still shadowed by the same unanswered question that followed her out of court. If she didn't do it, then who did? And why were they still free? The tension never really eased. Every time a new podcast episode dropped, every time an online sleuth claimed to have uncovered new evidence, the arguments flared again. At coffee shops in Canton, people still spoke in lowered voices when her name came up, always checking over their shoulders. The courthouse might have closed the criminal file, but in the court of public opinion, the trial was still wide open. In one of her rare unguarded moments, caught by a documentary camera crew, Karen stood by a window, looking out at the street below. She didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. If I'm innocent, then someone I know, someone I've seen, killed John, and they've been watching me all this time. The camera didn't move. Outside, the snow began to fall again.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe for more Echoed Crime content. Thank you.